of the Atlas Society Asks. I am Jennifer Grossman. My friends know me as JAG. I am CEO of the Atlas Society, which is the leading nonprofit introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in creative ways. Today, we are joined by Nadine Strossen. Before I even get into introducing the professor, I wanted to remind all of you that are joining us either on Zoom or streaming live on Facebook and YouTube to please go ahead, type in your questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. If you are on Zoom, just type them into the Q&A, and if you are on other platforms, just type them into the comment stream. Please try to make them short so I can grab them. Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School, specializing in constitutional law and civil liberties. She served as the first female president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008, the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards. She has been named one of America's 100 most influential lawyers by the National Law Journal. Her books include Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, and more recently, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech and Not Censorship, published in 2018, and I understand a newer edition with an epilogue that we're going to talk about, published more recently. So Nadine, thanks again for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. I really look forward to our conversation.
So Nadine, I know, having read and listened to your book on Audible, you have been thinking and reading and speaking and writing about free speech since 1977, when the Skokie controversy erupted, so long that you had actually reached a point where you stopped receiving invitations to write more on the subject, feeling that basically you had said what you wanted to say. But that changed, I understand, in more recent times. Tell us what changed for you that led you to undertake writing this book.
I really felt, Jennifer, after decades of crusading for the most robust free speech and including defending hate speech, freedom for the thought that we hate, to quote the United States Supreme Court, that I had made every argument that I possibly could. And it was time to address other issues. And however, starting in around 2015, we started to see a wave of campus activism in support of human rights, against police abuse, in favor of racial justice and equality, causes that I certainly have supported as a human rights crusader. But all of those movements seem to be pervaded by growing antipathy toward free speech. Students started denouncing free speech, associating it only with hate mongers and racists. And we started to even see signs saying, free speech is itself a hateful concept. A local leader of the ACLU in Virginia, who was going to be speaking at the College of William and Mary, her own alma mater, about student free speech rights, including the right to protest, was not able to deliver her message. She was shouted down by a really hostile crowd of students who said they were speaking for Black Lives Matter, and they had placards that said free speech is fascism. ACLU would have defended Hitler too. And it was really heartbreaking because you could see that many students wanted to speak to her, to hear her ideas. They even approached her at the platform, but the demonstrators prevented that exchange. So I was really driven to try once again to explain my perspective, which is reinforced by history, by experience around the world, not only the United States, that precisely those who are advocating for human rights, who are advocating for social justice, are the ones who are most dependent on a robust free speech, robust enough to extend even to what other people will consider to be hateful speech. So I tried to make more persuasive arguments. I hope I succeeded.
You mentioned that while you were encouraged by the increased student activism for egalitarian causes, you were disheartened at the same time by the rise of students seeking to censor other points of view. As a philosophy organization, I think we would be interested, would it be possible that both are being driven by this kind of postmodern education emphasis on identity politics, not strictly Marxist per se, but oppressors, oppressed, and thinking about people not as individuals necessarily, but as members of a grievance group? Or do you see them as totally separate?
I have to say that as a civil libertarian, I am troubled by what I see as an overemphasis on group identity of every sort. We hear the term snowflake used in one sense recently. I like to think of snowflakes with the understanding that every single one of them is unique, right? No two are alike. And to me, that is what is true of each of us as individuals. Of course, in a society that has treated people in different ways, including discriminatory and oppressive ways, based on certain demographic characteristics, we would be naive not to take that factor into account. The fact that I am a woman, and I certainly have been deprived of certain opportunities given my age earlier in my life on that basis. Of course, gender is an important aspect of who I am, but it is only one of infinite number of characteristics. And what I have always resisted is this notion of essentialism, that each of us can be summarized by focusing on one or just a handful of ethnic demographic type characteristics. I think that's really understating our uniqueness as human beings and our autonomy to create our own identity and sense of a purpose.
And I think it's also just a kind of disempowering if we focus and teach students that to maybe overemphasize their identity as a member of a historically discriminated against group, and not to focus on all of the possibilities. I mean, if you think about yourself as a victim,
As
you
a
just
victim is
see
really
yourself.
is really disempowering and patronizing, and of course it's not nice to be taught that one is an oppressor. Also, I think so. I agree with your basic point. Yes.
So while your book was born out of your concern about what you saw happening on campus, as the students who embrace that cancel culture on campus start moving into publishing and journalism, are we going to see more, examples like the Simon and Schuster's canceling the publication of Senator Josh Hawley's book, and more employee revolts like you saw at Politico for letting Ben Shapiro guest edit? So I guess the question is whether or not this is a dynamic that's coming out of the universities, or if you think it's more of a sort of a culture-wide infection, if you will.
I would say both of the above, Jennifer, in a really important book that came out in 2018 called The Coddling of the American Mind, co-authored by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. They did discuss this phenomenon that those who had been educated in a culture, campus culture, that unfortunately was becoming more hostile toward free speech, toward intellectual diversity, and open discourse and inquiry, that as those people graduated and moved into the employment sphere, the government sphere, that we were going to start to see similar patterns there. But I also think that there is a culture-wide acceptance. You use the term cancel culture and hostility toward free speech. For many years now, surveys that have been done of the general public's attitude toward free speech has shown increasing hostility toward the general concept and an increasing willingness, indeed demand, for the government to suppress certain controversial, unpopular speech. Sadly, the surveys show that that antipathy toward free speech is disproportionately coming from certain sectors, including the left end of the political spectrum, Democrats rather than Republicans, women rather than men, and racial minorities. And I say that that's sad because those are certainly those who have traditionally been disempowered based on gender, race, and so forth are the ones that I believe history and current events demonstrate are most dependent on a robust free speech. And it's logical, right? By definition, if you are a member of a political or ethnic or other kind of minority, you are never going to wield majoritarian political power. And so you are dependent on individual rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of association in order to advocate your causes. And you are especially threatened by a government that's accountable to a majority to wield discretionary power. It's predictably not going to be wielded in a way that is favorable to your causes and your views.
You mentioned Greg Lukianoff. Actually, we have him booked for, I think, a couple of weeks from now. So this is our free speech year and a big priority for us.
He's terrific.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that. So Nadine, in your book, which is Discipline in its focus on government censorship, making the case against hate speech laws, you also seem to be making the case in principle, and I understand that the paperback, the newer edition, has this in its epilogue, the principle that suppression of disfavored views, including on social media, can ultimately backfire. So what are some of the blind spots, if you will, that tech or social media platforms may be missing when it comes to suppressing or removing, again, which you argue your position is they have the right to do that, but what may be the unintended consequences of such moves?
So, if I may put on my law professor hat for just 10 seconds, Jennifer, contrary to many popular misconceptions, although the United States First Amendment free speech protection is very strong, it is not absolute. Government is permitted to restrict speech if, but only if, the speech directly causes or threatens certain specific, imminent, serious harm. And the only way to prevent that harm is through punishing the speech. Examples include intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently, or a true threat where the speaker is targeting the threat at a specific individual or small groups and intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the audience that they will be subject to attack, targeted harassment, or bullying. So when the speech has a tight and direct connection to actual harm, it can and should be punished. But if you loosen up that standard, as is done under the content moderation policies of social media companies, as is done under the hate speech laws in other countries, you're going back to what we used to have in the United States called essentially the bad tendency test. If speech might indirectly, possibly at some point in the future, have a tendency to cause some harm, then it can be punished. And that simply gives too much discretion to whoever has the power to enforce that so-called standard, right? It's really no standard at all. And whether it's enforced by the government or whether it's enforced by a human content moderator working for Facebook, or whether it's enforced by an algorithm at Twitter, inevitably it is going to over censor perfectly legitimate and even important speech because somebody or an algorithm subjectively determines that it satisfies this loose standard. Now, again, predictably, one would expect that the strict enforcement, the over enforcement, would disproportionately fall on those who lack political power. And in fact, for many years, there's been a large coalition of civil rights and civil liberties organizations complaining to Facebook that they were disproportionately and unfairly being taken down, including leaders of Black Lives Matter, pipeline protesters, other so-called social justice warriors, right? And even ironically, people who were quoting hate speech that had been directed at them as members of minorities, certainly not because they wanted to spread hateful ideas, but number one, because they wanted to show that racism is still a problem and to mobilize people against it, because they were looking for sympathy and support for the hurt they had suffered. So, in other words, not only were these loose standards ineffective at dealing with the underlying problem of hateful speech, but they were even counterproductive in taking down what we often call counter speech, speech that is trying to rebut and refute that hateful speech.
Well, I want to encourage those of you who are joining us on Facebook, YouTube, and also on Zoom. Please tee up your questions. This is just a wonderful honor and a privilege to be able to have this time with Nadine. And you mentioned that a lot of the calls for more suppression of this speech is coming from more of the left Democratic side. I also thought that this was interesting for me to read. I'm not coming from the Democratic left side, but part of what we see with social media is we get these kinds of silos. So I learned a lot of stuff in here that I had not known about, such as including those examples that you gave about these complaints that were coming from more of the Black Lives Matter movement about censorship. So
If I can
yeah.
make a point though, Jennifer, there certainly is plenty of censorship support coming from the right end of the political spectrum as well. So I don't want to at all make it seem as if I think that conservatives and Republicans get a free pass on this issue. In fact, you mentioned, I think you mentioned Josh Hawley being taken off. I think what you didn't mention is that Josh Hawley, from the minute he was elected to the Senate, has been crusading for government regulation and censorship of the social media companies, which it's a problem, especially for those who, I would assume, for those who support Ayn Rand's philosophy, because, and I certainly am not an anti-capitalist. I believe that these companies have not only their own property rights, but they have their own free speech rights as communications platforms. And that means that they have a right to decide whom to host and whom not to host, what speech and what speakers. Just as you have no obligation to have me on your platform, I'm very honored that you decided I could be there. Facebook also doesn't have an obligation. Frankly, Facebook doesn't have an obligation to host this, which is a little bit worrying because,
Yes. No, hey, fair enough. And point absolutely well taken. I was appalled to see the calls for criminalizing burning the American flag. I think it's terrible. I don't want anybody to burn the flag, but I'd rather know who actually, I think that hurts those people's causes a lot more than it helps. But you have said, you did say back in, I think, February of last year, you posted a video in response to the question, do you have a right to not be kicked off of a social media platform? And your emphatic answer was no. And in preparation for the Draw My Life that we are releasing later this week, My Name is Free Speech, I went back and I read a lot of Ayn Rand's position on the matter. And, you know, the big takeaway, what she wrote the most about was that freedom of speech means freedom from interference and freedom from suppression and punitive action and nothing else. So to paraphrase the way she talked about it, your right to free speech does not mean that somebody else has to provide you with a microphone.
Yeah, it's becoming really complicated as a couple of the dominant platforms, including Facebook and Google, are so essential for conducting business. I mean, even your organization, right, is dependent to some extent on these platforms. And so recently you have even libertarian economists and law professors advocating that perhaps these companies should be treated like regulated public utilities or common carriers, that they are such an essential part of the infrastructure, similar to the way the landline telephone companies were in the last century, that there's a common law obligation for them to treat everybody reasonably, fairly, and non-discriminatorily. And that I was really quite surprised. Recently, Richard Epstein, who's a prominent libertarian law professor, Chicago School, teaching at NYU, he had an interview in the Wall Street Journal where he advocated that approach.
Interesting. Well, I want those who are joining us on the on YouTube, on Zoom, on Facebook to jump in. Please don't say anything that will get us yanked off of those platforms, because as Nadine,
Ooh, see, isn't that dangerous though when we
you know,
do?
but Nadine, this
I know
happens.
you're kind of joking, but you
I'm
know
kind
that.
of joking, but I'll give you a real life example. When we did earlier this spring, well, last year spring, we did My Name is Coronavirus. So we took that method of applying the Draw My Life, and we told the story of the virus. But then when we were talking about the origins, it was becoming clear that maybe this wasn't, it wasn't coming out of what we thought it was coming out of. But I said, well, if I say what I knew at that slice time in history to be the truth, or as best as we could ascertain the truth, that anybody who was having that position, that their not only the videos were getting yanked, but in some cases their entire accounts were getting yanked. So this is a very real time issue that happens with us, and I think it's it is a shame when we are pulling back. I know I have seen in the past few weeks, just, and it's in very specific days when our social media that have been growing, and then like on one day it'll just have a spike going down, and just even internally we talking about, well, did we post something that day that just our audience had a really adverse effect? But then we'll go around and we'll talk to other people in the community, and they'll say, no, the same thing happened to us that day, that they didn't get purged, but there were enough accounts that did get purged, that it was, so it's a very scary.
And it would be really interesting from your philosophical perspective and that of supporters of your organization. You might come at this somewhat differently from me as a civil libertarian. I know I've had many arguments with my libertarian friends at the Cato Institute, but the ACLU, and I agree, has always taken the perspective that if any entity or individual has enough power power to, in effect, suppress what we think should be inherent human rights, including the right to free speech, then we have to find some way to constrain that power abuse. It's not going to be the US Constitution because that only imposes restraints on government, but there have to be some other options. And a really good analogy is the civil rights laws. And I know that some libertarians oppose those, but basically, until those laws were passed, it was completely legal for even the most powerful, large private sector entity, a university, a corporation, a hotel chain, a restaurant chain, to discriminate on any basis they wanted, including race, gender, religion, you name it. It was not illegal under the US Constitution because they were not government entities. So the ACLU lobbied for anti-discrimination laws. I think correctly. That would be another subject perhaps for debate. But I think there is an analogy in this situation. But I would be very nervous about any heavy-handed government imposition on these companies of ways that they may or may not moderate content. For those who are really large and dominant, I would be more in favor of insisting that they adhere to basic free speech standards, since they're wielding power that exceeds the power that governments have wielded in the past, right? In the past, governments used to censor private sector speakers. Now we have private sector companies censoring the most powerful government officials in the world. And that's bad, not only for the free speech of Donald Trump himself, but for the free speech right of everybody who wants to hear him, including his opponents who want to hear his messages so they can respond to it. And it's certainly very dangerous for democracy, where we, the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, wield sovereign power. How can we do that if we cannot hear what is being said by those we have elected? And how can we hold them accountable to us? The US Supreme Court said that when the speech is about public affairs or by public officials or about public officials, it's more than a matter of individual self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. And in that sense, I think that while I defend his rights under a capitalistic and free speech system, I think that Mark Zuckerberg poses a greater danger than Donald Trump or Joe Biden possibly could, because at least we have the checks of the Constitution for the government officials. We can diselect them, we can impeach them, and so forth, but we don't have any of those remedies against the Zuckerbergs of the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting, particularly in light of Parler and what happened with Parler, where they, conservatives who were either banned or purged or just shrugged when it came to Facebook and Twitter. They went off and they created their own platform, and then just,
Parler,
overnight.
I did 2 interviews on Parler, and I'm absolutely convinced that their mission was to provide a free speech friendly platform. A lot of conservatives flocked there because they were being kicked off the mainstream media, but Parler actually made very robust outreach to prominent liberals and progressives, even offering to pay if they would bring a certain number of followers with them. And so I think it was just a coincidence that those who were hungering for free speech protection were disproportionately on the right.
So now you talked about that while the Constitution isn't necessarily a remedy in some of these cases, that there may be other legislation or what have you. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention yesterday, that Ron DeSantis in Florida, governor of Florida, came forward with essentially this with a proposal for legislation that was in part stemming from the idea that when social media companies can deplatform a candidate or politicians or suppress stories which may be damaging to a particular candidate or, government, that is essentially like an in-kind donation, and that can be fined on a state level. Is that a
That makes me
legitimate?
very nervous. I have to say, the
Yeah.
ACLU, this makes us hated among liberals and progressives, but the ACLU has always opposed campaign finance laws for the very reason that the Supreme Court has been striking them down. Of course, the Supreme Court has never said that money is speech. But the Supreme Court has said that in order to disseminate your message effectively, you have to spend money. And that certainly is true when you're talking about the really expensive broadcast media. And therefore, if you put limits on how much money people can spend to advocate their cause or their candidate, that's going to reduce the amount of advocacy. So I'm very leery about any such kind of regulation. And it also seems to me that the criteria are, again, so subjective that it would require like some government enforcers to be monitoring the expression, to be looking for violations, and that's going to exert an enormous chilling effect on would-be users of the platform. So that proposal makes me very nervous.
So again, I want to encourage those who are joining us to ask your questions. I'm going to get to them, but I have so many questions for Nadine, myself, going back away from the law more to culture as well. Last summer, you were one of the signatories on Harper Bazaar's a letter on justice and open debate, which for one stated, quote, restriction on debate, whether by an impressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power. The letter received a lot of criticism and some blowback. Could you just share, tell us what happened, give us a little bit of the background on that
I'm very
experience?
proud of having signed that letter, which made a really important point, which unfortunately continues to be very true, which is there is this push to cancel not only ideas that are deemed to be objectionable, not politically correct, but even the entire person who has dared to utter that idea or to publish it or not to censor it, because there's guilt by association involved here too, that we want to completely deny any platform moving forward to that person. And ironically, shortly after the letter went public, exactly that happened. There was a campaign to have somebody who signed the letter to have her fired. There was her employer at, I can't remember which publication it was, a magazine, was pressured. And why? Not only because of objection to the ideas in the letter, but because of who signed the letter. And I think the big target there was J.K. Rowling, because a lot of people don't like some comments she's made about transgender people. So you add, you don't like her ideas, and so there's guilt by association if you sign a letter that has absolutely nothing to do with transgender issues. And therefore, not only are we rebutting, they're not rebutting the idea at all. They're simply asking for a person to be punished, canceled. Now, one objection that I thought was well taken, and it made me realize that the letter was not as clear as it should have been on this point. Some people said, look, all of you who signed this letter are speaking from positions of security and prominence, and obviously you're not being canceled or you're not self-censoring, or why would you sign this letter? And I think that's absolutely correct. We were not, speaking for myself at least, I wasn't particularly fearful that I would lose any opportunity to express my views. But I was speaking on behalf of those who are not so well established, including my students and students that I meet all over the world when I speak, who are afraid to voice opinions that might be seen as controversial, and with good reason. Look at the students who have been outstanding high school students who have been accepted to various colleges and universities, and somebody dredges up some, horrible, hateful thing that they posted on social media years ago when they were teenagers and probably drunk. I mean, that's not to be applauded that they did that, but are we going to reduce? You and I were talking earlier, Jennifer, about, reduction of people to one identity. What seems to me even worse, to reduce them to the stupidest drunken tweet that they ever issued when they were adolescents, and to say, therefore, you're going to be deprived of the Harvard education, the other university education that you would have received. That is really problematic. And so to me, the cancellation of young people, the unforgivingness that is thwarting debate and thwarting education and careers.
All right. Well, I still have a few other questions I'm going to want to get to, including one of the things I thought was most shocking and surprising to me was about hate speech laws in Nazi Germany. But I'm going to put that off because we have our questions here. And one of the young people who actually came to our gala and who's a part of our book club, and that's Erin Tao. And Erin, guess who's going to be next on our book club? It's going to be Professor Strossen. So, but here's a hot potato one. Nadine, I'm not sure if you're going to want to take this one or if you even have a perspective on it. His question is, from your view as a constitutional lawyer, did Trump's rhetoric leading to the Capitol Hill riots, does that fit the definition of incitement of imminent lawless action per the Brandenburg versus Ohio standard?
And is this a question from Aaron?
Yes.
Oh, good. Nice to meet you, Aaron. Thank you for the excellent question. Law professors are split on this, but I put myself in what I think is the majority, not that it matters. It's what I think is the correct perspective, that this appropriately strict standard that the Supreme Court has laid down for punishable incitement is not satisfied by anything that Trump said, either on January 6th or leading up to it. This is comes from the definition comes from a unanimous Supreme Court decision in 1969 called Brandenburg versus Ohio. I'm very proud that it was an ACLU case in which, by the way, we defended the speech, anti-civil libertarian speech, right? Freedom for the thought we hate, by a leader of a Ku Klux Klan rally who was denouncing Jews and blacks and people whose rights we defend. But there was a really important underlying principle here, which has been used to protect speech by civil rights activists and Black Lives Matter activists. Namely, the speaker has to intend to incite imminent violence that is likely to actually happen imminently. It is a very difficult standard to satisfy, and I think the imminence element would be very hard to prove here, and the intent element would also be very hard to prove. Let me just add one point, if I may. There was a similar complaint that was brought against Donald Trump when he was campaigning for president the first time around, based on statements that he made at a campaign rally where some demonstrators were demonstrating against him, and Trump said to his supporters, "Get him out of here! Get him out of here!" And he made some other insinuations, like, in the old days, we used to carry them out on a stretcher and pay your lawyer's fees. Arguably inducing not the most gentle treatment, to put it mildly. And they were roughed up and they brought a lawsuit against Trump for intentional incitement. And the judge on appeal said, it doesn't quite, it's close, it's worthy of examination, but it doesn't rise to that level because in addition to all of those other statements, Trump also said, don't hurt him. And I think he made similar kinds of statements more recently. So, on balance, I don't think it would satisfy the standard, but there are others who disagree.
Yeah, well, that's interesting to know that they're kind of roughly split. And I did watch that speech in live time, and it seemed to me that if you wanted to make the case that it was incitement, the fact that he talked about peacefully, protesting, and certainly an intent, I don't think the result was in his selfish best interest, hardly. Um, so let's see. MF Superstar asks, this kind of is going back to our earlier conversation about identity politics. Is the weaponization of the concept of whiteness, is that a way to fight hate? Or is that something that actually can foment and hate and dehumanize
Could
people?
I get a clarification of the question? I'm not sure I understand it.
Yeah, well, if MF Superstars is with us, maybe they can
That would, I would,
rephrase
that'd be
it for
great.
us, because, yeah, I'm not sure where they're coming from. This is a simple one. Janet Smith asks, Jennifer, where can I get your money pin? Go to the Atlas Society store and you
Oh,
can get it and support the Atlas Society at the same time. Um, okay, Vicky Seuss. Okay, well, I think you are going to take issue with this one. Facebook and Twitter are becoming almost public utilities since they removed Parler. Would a utility company decline service to a customer if they didn't like their views?
yeah. So this is exactly the argument that was made by Richard Epstein and is being made by others. But as you can imagine, Vicky, there are a lot of people that would share objectivist philosophy that I think would, no pun intended, object to that because they would say it's a private sector. I know my Cato Institute libertarian friends would object because they say it's a private sector entity and they are free to make whatever choices they want. And they're not literally endowed with a government sponsored monopoly, which would distinguish them from some of the companies that have been treated, and to the best of my knowledge, most of the companies that have been treated as regulated public utilities literally have an official government monopoly. I think it is a very serious issue and really worth examining. It would at most apply only to a few dominant companies, and hopefully we would see lowered barriers to entry and we would have parlors and other alternative platforms. That would be my ideal world where we would have multiple platforms that all of us could choose among with different content moderation policies. Some would be, complete freewheeling free speech. Some would be very strictly modified, and it would give us, ideally the same freedom of choice that we have when we decide what book to read.
Well, hopefully we will get to that place. I have said in the past, when the big tech companies themselves are the ones that are inviting regulation, that is something to worry about.
Be very nervous about
Because, yeah,
because it may actually entrench their positions. And certainly if it's regulation that is over the whole sector, which it sounded that the Rick DeSantis proposal was, the Josh Hawley. And by the way, there was very little that former President Trump and current President Biden agreed on, but they both agreed that Section 230 should be repealed, which would create huge potential liability for platforms, meaning that it would become even harder for new companies to emerge. No surprise that Mark Zuckerberg is supporting a repeal or at least a big revision of Section Section 230. So that's another reason we have to be very careful about potential unintended consequences of what might seem like a positive step, but might in fact further entrench the power of these dominant companies who can more easily deal with the regulations than an upstart could.
So with about 15 minutes left, I'm going to return to some audience questions, but I did not want to run out of time without talking about that element of the book that I thought was really so surprising to me, because people who want to legislate hate speech believe that doing so would reduce hatred and bad ideas and protect those who are the objects of such hate speech. But as you point out in your book, was just how many hate speech laws had existed in Germany prior to the rise of the Nazis. You are the daughter of a German-born Holocaust survivor who I understand barely survived Buchenwald. You write that if hate speech laws would have averted that atrocity, you would support them, but they didn't. So why not?
For the same reason that prohibition laws in general don't work, right? There's the forbidden fruits aspect. And in fact, the Nazis were prosecuted under the very strict anti-hate speech laws at the time in the Weimar Republic. And and with many convictions. And the leading Jewish organization at the time said that these were by and large, well-handled prosecutions. It wasn't as if they were bungled. But the Nazis welcomed the trials as propaganda opportunities to draw attention to their ideas that they otherwise never would have received, and even sympathy. And we see that today. When people are kicked off platforms, it often derives, or when they're deplatformed on campus, they kind of like it because it gives them much more attention and support than they otherwise would have received. And meanwhile, the real problem in Nazi Germany was that actual violence was not prevented. The Nazis were assaulting and murdering their political opponents and members of minority groups. And that's something that we really cannot lose sight of. And I think you talked about that earlier, Jennifer, when you referred to the people who actually did commit violence on January 6th. They're responsible. And they've got to be held criminally accountable for that. And to some extent, when you displace responsibility onto speech, not only are you unfairly punishing the speaker, but you're also unfairly exonerating those who actually conduct violent acts. Most people the vast majority of people who hear hateful ideas do not go out and commit hateful acts, right? We're repulsed by the ideas. We ignore them, we refute them, we redouble our efforts to work against hatred.
So Alan, oh gosh, Alan, we have to stop meeting like this. Alan was on my birthday party yesterday. We had a birthday party because, well, it was actually Ayn Rand's birthday. So, so we had a little gathering with some cake, and it was a lot of fun. But on more serious subject, Alan asks, it has been suggested, he gives the example of a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed by Philip Hamburger. It has been suggested, that Section 230 could be read to deny liability protection for taking things off as opposed to allowing things to be on the site.
I thought that was a fascinating op-ed, and I've been quoting it myself, Alan. You have to understand that this is, it's probably a minority position because most of the people who want to reform Section 230, including both Biden and Trump, were doing it for, well, I guess especially Biden, right? They want the platforms to take down even more speech, not the opposite. I don't know exactly how repealing Section 230 is likely to do that. But I also think if you look at the legislative history of Section 230, it's clear that the intent was to encourage platforms to engage in so called content moderation, some would call it censorship, that goes beyond, that allows them to take down speech that would be protected under the US Constitution. So this gets into a debate among lawyers: to what extent do you interpret a statute according to its text? And Hamburger does just a brilliant job of textual analysis. To what extent should you go beyond that and look at the intent? And I think clearly the intent of the statute was to increase censorial power on the part of the platforms.
So Nadine, you mentioned you're teaching your seminar today, and I am interested in, you wrote the book because you were concerned about this rising intolerance and a willingness to um, silence disfavored views on college campus. You have been teaching for a long time and interacting with young people. Are you see what kinds of shifts in attitudes from the times when you were out there and you were an early activist in the earlier civil rights eras? What's been happening?
Jennifer, I really have to say, let me start with this fact. I don't think my book would be published today. I mean, there is
Wow,
so
that's
much
a big.
pressure within the publishing industry that I think even, the guilt by association of defending free speech for hate mongers. I shouldn't say. Oxford University Press is headed by a wonderful person who named Nico Fund, who is completely dedicated to free speech. But I have no doubt that he would be under enormous pressure, especially from his younger staff members, not to touch this book with a 10-foot pole. So the cultural pressures against unpopular speech, anything that can be considered, the big three negative kinds of speech that are always pilloried are, and all of the terms are completely subjective and vague, but hate speech, disinformation or misinformation, and extremist or terrorist content, and public opinion polls, and even more importantly, attitudes among members of Congress and government. The Biden administration, as well as the Trump administration, are very much in favor of cracking down on this speech. The Hamburger perspective of how can we interpret Section 230 to allow fewer restrictions is definitely the minority position. So there is, I think my book made a little dent among people who are willing to read it, but I think there are a lot of people who would just look at the title and say, I'm not going to read it.
How can they resist this beautiful color and design?
And I have to say, we were talking before we went on air, so to speak, that I think that people that take my free speech seminar, and to some extent people who come to hear me speak on campus, are probably self-selected. Now, that said, here's a really important point that I want to make. There are a lot of polls that show the vast majority of people do support general, I hope this isn't a dirty word in this crowd, liberal principles in the sense of classic liberalism, free speech, free thought, enlightenment, values, rationality, all of which are under attack. But that the vast majority of people are silent. They don't even vote in very large numbers, let alone become involved in the political process or the culture wars. And I think the culture and the policies are disproportionately being driven by extremes at either end of the political spectrum. So I really want to urge everybody who believes in free speech to please make your views known. Speak up. I know it can be very difficult to be attacked. I mean, free speech has become a dirty word in many quarters, but the problem is just going to get worse unless more of us exercise the right not to remain silent.
Yes, and I think to lead by example and to exercise, moral courage and to say, okay, I will accept the consequences. The more that each of us sort of shrink and retreat into silence, I think it doesn't end in a good place.
It's hard to ask people to accept the consequences, Jennifer, if it's going to be losing a job or
Well, and
even
it's very
social
true.
ostracism. These are very serious consequences.
It's that's quite true. And I'm always when students say, hey, I know what I'm supposed to say on this paper in order to pass. But if I say what I believe, even if it's well done, um, you know, I think part of the reason why a lot of students are opting not to go to college, because they are not finding it what it should be, which it really should be the bastion of critical thinking and free speech. But we are glad that you did manage to publish this under the wire, and we are going to have it as the subject of our book club, and you're going to see it in memes and other ways in which we can get this out to the public. Where can people learn more about your work? Where should we follow you, and how can we help get your
I'm
message out?
not on social media, if you can believe
Okay.
it. When it first, became a big thing, I was very concerned about individual privacy. Well, guess what? My greatest fears have been surpassed. I'm a big fan of George Orwell. I mean, this has the degree of surveillance has become so pervasive. I think that I'm subject to it even without being on those platforms, and that is so. Forgive me, you can't follow
Okay.
me that way, but I think if you use Dr. Google, you should find like zillions of podcast interviews and webinars and talks that I've given. They're very easy to find.
We did, and we will. We will continue. Definitely Orwellian times. I think the New York Times just came out for a call for some kind of Ministry of Truth or government, uh, agency to fight misinformation from their perspective. So, very, very fascinating. Never been more vital for this message than now. So, Nadine, thank you so very much, and look forward to thanking you in person before long. I want to thank all of you who are have joined us, who asked the questions. Also, thanks to those supporters of the Atlas Society who are joining us, and thanks to all of you who enjoy this kind of content for considering supporting the Atlas Society with your tax-deductible donations. So thank you very much, and thank you, Nadine, and everyone. Please join us next week. We're going to be sitting down with Chip Wilson, founder of Lululemon. So
Thank you, Jennifer, and many thanks to especially the young people. You're so important.
thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.